The massive chamber of the Galactic Council stretched out like a cathedral of power and politics. Thousands of alien beings filled the curved seats that rose up toward a glowing dome ceiling. The air itself seemed to hum with tension, and barely contained disgust as Ambassador Kim Tae-ho walked slowly to the center platform. His simple black diplomatic suit looked painfully ordinary among the exotic forms surrounding him. Kim could feel their eyes on him. Some had compound vision that saw in spectrums humans couldn't imagine. Others had no eyes at all but sensed him through vibrations or electromagnetic fields. All of them looked at him with the same expression, though, complete and utter disdain. The Vraxian delegate rose first. Commander Velthak stood nearly 4 meters tall, his body made of what looked like living crystal that caught and reflected the chamber's lights. When he moved, musical notes seemed to ring from his joints. He raised one arm and the massive displays around the chamber came to life. Human soldiers appeared on the screens. They looked small and fragile as they moved across battlefields, carrying weapons that seemed primitive by galactic standards. The footage showed humans falling to injuries that wouldn't even slow down most alien species. Blood, pain, death. Observe these creatures. Velthak's voice resonated like a bell tower. They propel small metal objects using controlled explosions. When pressure is applied to their calcium-based endoskeletons, the structures simply snap apart. I have seen hatchlings from my own world survive impacts that would liquefy these beings. Cruel laughter rippled through the chamber. The sound came in frequencies both high and low, creating an alien symphony of mockery that made Kim's teeth ache. A new voice slithered through the air. The Nethri representative had no fixed form, appearing as a massive serpent one moment and a flowing liquid the next. Consider their temporal limitations, the creature hissed. These humans live perhaps 100 of their planetary rotations before expiring. My youngest offspring has already survived for 3 millennia. How can such brief sparks of existence comprehend the long-term planning required for galactic civilization? More agreement echoed through the chamber. The insectoid Cathani clicked. Their mandibles, in what Kim had learned, was their version of laughter. The gas-based Flurians pulsed with colors that hurt human eyes to look at directly. Even the machine beings from the Nexus Collective emitted electronic tones that somehow managed to sound condescending. Kim watched as species after species stood to voice their objections to humanity's membership application. The Draknari complained about human emotional instability. The Zerans mocked their need for specific atmospheric conditions to survive. The Omnari questioned whether humans even qualified as a sapient species given their tendency toward warfare. Each criticism felt like a physical blow. Kim knew that back on Earth, billions of people were watching this broadcast. Children were staying up past their bedtime to see if humanity would finally join the galactic community. Scientists had spent decades preparing for this moment. Diplomats had crafted careful arguments about human potential and unique perspectives. None of it mattered now. The vote was a formality. One by one, all 12 major species cast their rejection. The chamber fell silent, except for the ambient hum of alien technology. Kim straightened his shoulders and cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice carried across the vast space without amplification. The people of Earth thank the Council for their consideration. We understand your decision and respect the wisdom of your ancient civilizations. The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but he delivered them with dignity. Somewhere in the crowd, he could hear what sounded like alien applause, though whether it was mocking or genuine appreciation for his composure, he couldn't tell. As Kim turned to leave, he carried with him the weight of his species' first and perhaps final rejection by the powers that ruled the galaxy. The silence in the chamber felt heavier than gravity itself. Ambassador Kim had barely taken 3 steps toward the exit when a voice like rolling thunder stopped him cold. High Counselor Zethmar had risen from his throne at the chamber's peak, and when he spoke, every conversation died instantly. Zethmar was ancient even by galactic standards. His species, the Eternal Wardens, lived for tens of thousands of years and served as the Council's ultimate authority. His body looked like it had been carved from black stone, with veins of silver light pulsing beneath the surface. When he moved, Reality itself seemed to bend slightly around him. "Ambassador of Earth," Zethmar's words echoed from every surface in the chamber. "Your species shows remarkable persistence in pursuing membership, despite repeated rejections. This trait, while admirable in its own limited way, has become tiresome to the Council." Kim felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Every diplomat's instinct told him to remain silent, but he could sense something shifting in the chamber's atmosphere. The alien delegates had gone completely still, like predators sensing movement in tall grass. "However," Zethmar continued, and that single word made Kim's blood run cold, "the Council recognizes that dismissing a species entirely without offering them a chance to prove themselves would be unjust. Therefore, we present humanity with one final opportunity." The massive displays around the chamber flickered to life again, but this time they showed something that made several alien delegates actually recoil in their seats. A planet hung in space like a festering wound. Its surface was a patchwork of acid storms, crystalline deserts that could slice through metal, and forests of carnivorous plants that moved like living nightmares. "Kethmoran," Zethmar announced, "what your species might call a death world. For 3,000 years, we have used it as our ultimate proving ground. The trial of ascension requires a single champion to survive on its surface for 7 days. 7 days with minimal equipment against predators that have evolved specifically to kill in an environment hostile to all known forms of life." Kim's mouth went completely dry. He had heard whispers about Kethmoran in diplomatic circles. It was where the Council sent their worst criminals to die slowly. It was where previous civilizations had sent their greatest warriors to prove their worth. None of the stories had happy endings. "In the past millennium, 47 species have attempted the trial." Zethmar's voice carried a note of dark amusement. 47 champions have perished. The last attempt was 3 centuries ago, when the Corvani Empire sent their greatest battlemaster. We recovered only fragments of his armor." The Vraxian delegate, Commander Velthak, leaned forward with obvious excitement. Surely the humans would not be so foolish as to accept such terms. Their champion would not survive the first night. Other voices began joining in. The Serpentine Nethri representative hissed with laughter. "Perhaps we should establish a betting pool on how quickly their representative expires. I would wager no more than 6 hours. 4 hours, clicked one of the insectoid Kithani. The acid storms alone would dissolve their fragile skin. Kim felt the weight of billions of people pressing down on his shoulders. Back on Earth, families were gathered around screens watching this moment. Children who dreamed of traveling to the stars, scientists who had dedicated their lives to making contact with alien civilizations, soldiers who had fought and died believing that humanity deserved a place among the galactic community. "The choice is simple," Zethmar's voice cut through the growing chatter. "Accept the trial of ascension, or be forever barred from petitioning this council. Choose now, Ambassador. Your species' future hangs in the balance." Kim closed his eyes for a moment that felt like an eternity. He thought about his daughter back home, barely 10 years old, who had made him promise to bring back pictures of aliens for her school project. He thought about the letter in his pocket from Earth's greatest scientists, begging him to secure humanity's place in the galaxy. When he opened his eyes, his voice was steady and clear. "On behalf of the people of Earth, I accept the trial of ascension." The chamber exploded into sounds that no human throat could make. Chittering, buzzing, electronic beeping, and musical tones that sounded like celebration mixed with anticipation. The aliens weren't just amused anymore. They were excited. They were going to watch humanity's champion die on the most dangerous world in known space, and they could barely contain their enthusiasm. Kim stood perfectly still in the center of it all, wondering if he had just signed his species' death warrant. The emergency meeting had been called at 3 a.m, pulling Earth's top military commanders from their beds with a message that simply read, "Code Black, immediate. Response required." The secure briefing room beneath the Pentagon hummed with nervous energy as officers filed in, still adjusting their hastily donned uniforms. General Lee Hai-jin stood at the front of the room, her face grave as she waited for everyone to settle. Behind her, massive screens displayed the recording from the Galactic Council chamber. The alien faces looked down at the assembled humans with expressions that somehow managed to be both curious and dismissive. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Lee began, her voice cutting through the quiet murmur of conversation. 6 hours ago, Ambassador Kim accepted a challenge that will determine humanity's future. The room fell completely silent. Coffee cups stopped halfway to lips, papers stopped rustling. Even the air conditioning seemed to quiet down, as if the building itself was holding its breath. General Lee activated the displays, showing footage of Kethmoran that made several officers unconsciously lean back in their seats. "This is where our champion will spend 7 days, alone, with equipment that wouldn't keep you alive for 7 hours in a normal wilderness survival situation." Staff Sergeant Park Min-ho sat in the third row, his hands folded calmly in his lap, as he studied the images. While other officers whispered to each other or shook their heads in disbelief, Park remained perfectly still. His weathered face showed no emotion, as scenes of acid storms and carnivorous plants filled the screens. At 32, Park had seen more combat than most soldiers twice his age. His file read like a catalogue of the world's worst places to be: stationed, the mountains of Afghanistan, the jungles of Southeast Asia, the frozen wastelands of the Arctic where he'd trained local forces in extreme weather survival. Each assignment had left its mark on him, creating the kind of calm that only comes from repeatedly facing death and walking away. "The Council has made it clear," General Lee continued, "that this is not a test of technology or firepower. It's a test of will, of the ability to survive when everything around you is trying to kill you." She paused, scanning the room. "I won't lie to you. The mathematical probability of survival is essentially 0. Park stood up. The movement was so sudden and unexpected that conversations stopped mid-sentence throughout the room. Every head turned toward him as he took a step forward. "Sir, I volunteer for the trial," he said simply. His voice was quiet, but it carried clearly through the silent room. There was no drama in his words, no grand speeches about duty or honor. He spoke like he was volunteering for cafeteria duty, not a mission that would almost certainly end in his death. General Lee studied him carefully. Park was completely unremarkable by human standards. Average height, maybe 5'8" on a good day. Lean build from years of military fitness, but nothing that would impress anyone at a gym. His black hair was starting to show gray at the temples, and his face had the kind of lines that came from squinting into hostile territory. For most of his adult life, but his eyes told a different story. They held the kind of steady intensity that made people instinctively trust him in crisis situations. These were the eyes of someone who had faced impossible odds before and somehow found a way through. "Sergeant Park," General Lee said, pulling up his service record on her tablet. 17 successful deep reconnaissance missions, expert marksman, fluent in 7 languages, specialized training in wilderness survival, urban warfare, and psychological operations. She looked up at him. "Impressive resume, but this isn't like anything you've faced before." Park nodded slowly. "Ma'am, with respect, none of us know what we're capable of until we're tested beyond our limits. Someone has to go. Might as well be someone who's been practicing for it his whole career." Other officers began speaking up. Colonel Rodriguez from Special Operations argued that they needed more time to analyze the challenge. Major Thompson suggested sending a team instead of a single person. Captain Kim worried about the political implications if their champion failed. Park listened to it all without comment, his expression unchanged. Finally, General Lee held up a hand for silence. "The equipment package is minimal," she warned, looking directly at Park. "Standard survival gear, a basic energy weapon that probably won't work against anything you encounter, no backup, no extraction plan if things go wrong, no communication with Earth once you're on the surface." Park's response was immediate and matter-of-fact. "Understood, ma'am. When do I leave?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around the room, career military officers who had spent their lives preparing for the worst-case scenarios looked at this quiet man who had just volunteered to face something worse than their worst nightmares. General Lee closed the file and looked at Park with something that might have been respect. "Transport leaves in 18 hours. I suggest you use that time to say goodbye to anyone who matters." Park nodded once and turned to leave. As he walked toward the door, every person in the room knew they were watching humanity's last hope walk away to face the impossible. The transport ship shuddered as it entered Kethmaran's atmosphere, its hull groaning under the stress of winds. That could tear apart most aircraft. Park sat strapped into his seat, watching through the small porthole as they descended through layers of poisonous clouds. Lightning crackled around them in colors that shouldn't exist, purple and green bolts that seemed to actively hunt the ship. The pilot, a nervous Vraxian technician, kept glancing back at Park through the cockpit door. His crystalline features showed obvious confusion about why anyone would willingly come to this place. "Human," he called back, his voice ringing like struck metal. "Are you certain about this? Even our criminals beg for mercy when we bring them." "Here?" Park checked his equipment one final time. A basic survival pack with enough food and water for 3 days. A shelter that might protect him from light acid rain. An energy weapon that looked like it belonged in a museum. Medical supplies that would barely handle a paper cut, let alone the injuries he was likely to face. "I'm sure," Park replied calmly. The ship touched down on what passed for a landing zone, a flat stretch of ground that only occasionally erupted with toxic geysers. Through the porthole, Park could see his new home for the next week. The landscape looked like something from humanity's worst nightmares, mixed with an alien fever dream. The ground itself was made of sharp, crystalline formations that shifted and moved like living things. Some areas glowed with their own internal light, probably radioactive. Others were covered in what looked like snow but moved and writhed like it was alive. In the distance, mountains of black glass rose into the storm-filled sky, their peaks wreathed in clouds that rained liquid fire. The transport's doors hissed open, and immediately Park's nose burned from the acidic air. His eyes watered as chemical smells invaded his lungs. The temperature gauge on his suit showed the outside air bouncing between 40 degrees below zero and 120 above, sometimes changing by 50 degrees in the span of a minute. Park shouldered his pack and walked to the door. The farm. Vraxian pilot backed away from him like he was watching a dead man walking. "The observers will track your progress," the pilot said. "When you die, we will retrieve your remains for your species." "When I survive," Park corrected quietly, "you'll pick me up in 7 days." He stepped off the transport onto Kethmaran's surface. The ground crunched under his boots like broken glass, and he could feel the heat through his boot soles, even with military-grade protection. Behind him, the transport lifted off immediately, as if staying even another second might contaminate. It high above in orbit, the alien observers settled in to watch the show. Commander Velthak had established a betting pool among the council representatives. The Nethri delegate wagered that Park would die within 4 hours from environmental exposure. The insectoid Kethani bet on 6 hours, predicting predator attack. Even the most optimistic estimate gave him less than 12 hours. Park ignored the pain in his lungs and began walking. His first priority was finding shelter before the next acid storm hit. The sky was already darkening with purple clouds that promised rain that could strip flesh from bone. He hadn't walked more than a kilometer when he heard them. A sound like grinding metal mixed with animal growls echoed across the crystalline wasteland. Park dropped behind a rock formation and pulled out his binoculars. The saber stalkers moved like nightmare versions of Earth's big cats. Each one was the size of a tiger but built like a tank, with 6 legs ending in claws that could tear through steel. Their backs were covered in razor-sharp bone plates that caught and reflected the planet's weird light. There were 5 of them, moving in perfect coordination as they hunted something across the broken terrain. Park realized with a sinking feeling that he was the something they were hunting. The lead stalker raised its head and made a sound like a buzzsaw cutting through metal. The others spread out in response, beginning to surround Park's position. These weren't just animals, they were intelligent pack hunters that had evolved on a world where only the most dangerous creatures survived. Park studied the terrain around him. The ground was unstable here, with recent seismic activity creating loose rock formations. Above him, a cliff face showed stress fractures from the constant temperature changes. It was dangerous ground that could collapse at any moment. which gave him an idea. Instead of running, Park began climbing toward the unstable cliff face. The saber stalkers followed, their claws finding purchase on surfaces that would have been impossible for most creatures. But as they climbed, Park reached into his pack and pulled out a small explosive charge meant for emergency shelter construction. He placed the charge carefully at a key stress point in the rock face and continued climbing. The stalkers were getting closer, their metal-grinding calls echoing off the cliff walls. Park could smell. The charge detonated just as the lead stalker reached for him. The entire cliff face came down in a roar of breaking stone and crystalline debris. 3 of the creatures disappeared under tons of rock, while the other 2 barely escaped by leaping to safety. Park used the chaos to disappear into a network of caves that the avalanche had revealed. Behind him, the 2 surviving stalkers prowled the rubble pile, making frustrated sounds as they searched for their escaped prey. High in orbit, the alien observers watched with mild surprise. The human had survived his first encounter, but barely. Commander Velthak adjusted his bet from 4 hours to 8 hours, acknowledging that the primitive creature had shown more cunning than expected. Park pressed deeper into the cave system, his flashlight cutting through absolute darkness. The air was cleaner here, though it still burned his throat. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, which might mean a source he could purify. Day 1 was ending, and Park was still alive. But as he settled into a small chamber deep underground, he could hear new sounds echoing through the cave system, things that moved in the darkness, things that had been disturbed by the avalanche and were now very interested in finding out what had invaded their territory. Kethmaran was just getting started with him. Park woke on his 3rd morning to the sound of silence, which on Kethmaran was more terrifying than any noise. The constant background chorus of acid storms, erupting geysers, and predator calls had become his alarm clock. When everything went quiet, it meant something big was moving through the area, something that made all the other dangerous creatures hide. He crawled out of the shallow cave where he'd spent the night, and immediately saw them. Claw marks carved deep into the solid crystalline rock face, each groove as wide as Park's fist and perfectly parallel. The cuts were so clean they looked like they'd been made with industrial equipment, not biological claws. Park had seen files on every known predator species during his mission briefing, but these marks were different. They belonged to something that didn't just hunt for food. These were territorial markings, a signature left behind by a creature that wanted other beings to know who owned this piece of hell. His military training kicked in automatically. Park pulled out his scanner and measured the marks. 4 parallel grooves, each one nearly 30 centimeters long and carved at least 10 centimeters deep into rock that was harder than earth steel. Whatever made these marks had strength that defied physics by human understanding. As he studied the claw marks, Park's blood went cold. He recognized the pattern from classified military files that most soldiers never saw. These were the signature marks of Garax the Destroyer, a Vraxian war criminal who had been exiled to Kethmaran 2 years ago after committing acts so horrific that even the battle-hardened Vraxian military couldn't stomach executing him quickly. The files painted a picture of a monster that stood 4 meters tall with natural crystal armor plating that could deflect military-grade weapons. His arms could extend retractable blade appendages that were sharper than surgical instruments and stronger than titanium. But what made Garax truly terrifying wasn't his physical capabilities. It was his intelligence. He was a tactical genius who had outmaneuvered entire military fleets before his capture. Park's hands shook slightly as he realized what this meant. He wasn't just facing a death world anymore. He was sharing it with something that had killed millions of beings across multiple star systems, something that viewed murder as an art form. The morning passed in tense silence as Park moved carefully through the crystalline wasteland, trying to put distance between himself and the claw marks, but every step felt watched. Every shadow seemed to hide something monstrous. The alien observers in orbit had gone completely quiet, which meant they knew something he didn't. By afternoon, Park found his answer. In a shallow valley between 2 ridges of black glass, he discovered what remained of Garax's most recent victim, The body belonged to a Nethri warrior, one of the serpentine species known for their incredible regenerative abilities and near indestructible physiology. The corpse was twisted into a shape that shouldn't have been possible. Arms bent in directions that violated anatomy. The warrior's natural armor had been peeled away like opening a can, exposing internal organs that had been arranged in a precise pattern. This wasn't the result of hunger or territorial dispute. This was art. Horrible, deliberate art created by something that enjoyed causing pain. Carved into the ground next to the body was a message in the universal trade language that all spacefaring species knew. New prey detected. The hunt begins. At nightfall, Park's mouth went dry. Garax wasn't just aware of his presence, he was playing with him. The war criminal was treating this like entertainment, giving Park just enough time to understand exactly what kind of death awaited him. As the sun began to set behind Kethmoran's perpetual storm clouds, Park found the highest ground he could, and settled in to wait. Running would be pointless. Garax had been hunting on this world for 2 years, and knew every hiding place, every escape route. The only chance was to make a stand, and hope that human unpredictability might create an opening. The first sound came just as full darkness fell, a grinding noise like massive gears turning, mixed with the whisper of razor-sharp metal sliding against crystal. It echoed across the wasteland from multiple directions, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. Garax was playing psychological warfare, using the planet's acoustics to make himself seem to be everywhere at once. Park crouched behind a rock formation and tried to calm his racing heart. His energy weapon felt pathetically small in his hands, like trying to fight a tank with a slingshot. The grinding sound grew closer, accompanied now by a new noise that made Park's skin crawl. Laughter, deep, rumbling laughter that seemed to come from the rocks themselves. Garax was enjoying this, savoring the fear he was creating. "Little human," a voice called across the wasteland, speaking perfect English with an accent like grinding stone. "I have studied your species since you arrived. So fragile, so brief, yet you came here anyway. How delightfully stupid." Park didn't respond, but his finger tightened on his weapon's trigger. Somewhere in the darkness, death was walking toward him on legs that could crush him without effort, guided by a mind that had orchestrated the destruction of entire worlds. The real trial was beginning, and Park was facing an opponent that had never lost a fight in its thousands of years of existence. The alien observers held their breath as they watched humanity's champion prepare to face something that even they feared. In the distance, the grinding sound grew closer, and Garax's laughter echoed across Kethmoran like thunder. The chase began. At dawn on the 4th day, and it quickly became clear that Park was fighting a battle he couldn't win through conventional means. Garax moved across Kethmoran's hostile landscape like he owned it, his 4-meter frame navigating obstacles that should have slowed him down. His crystalline armor caught the planet's strange light, making him look like a living weapon forged from the world itself. Park's only advantage was his size. Where Garax had to smash through barriers, Park could slip around them. Where the massive predator left deep footprints in the crystalline ground, Park could move almost silently across surfaces that would support his lighter weight. But speed and stealth could only delay the inevitable for so long. The first trap Park set was simple but effective. He led Garax toward a series of acid pools that bubbled and steamed in a natural depression between 2 ridges. The pools were connected by narrow bridges of solid rock that could barely support Park's weight. When Garax tried to follow, one of the bridges collapsed, dumping the war criminal into acid that would have dissolved most creatures instantly. Garax emerged from the pool 30 seconds later, his armor plating slightly dulled but otherwise undamaged. His laughter echoed across the wasteland as he effortlessly pulled himself out of the pit. "Clever little human," his voice boomed, "but I have survived in acid storms for 2 years. You will need to do better than that." Park was already running toward his next prepared position. He had spent the previous night studying the terrain and identifying every potential trap, every unstable formation, every environmental hazard that might slow down his pursuer. It was going to be a long day. The second trap involved an unstable cliff face that Park had weakened with small explosive charges. As Garrix climbed after him, Park triggered the charges from a safe distance. Tons of rock came crashing down, and for a moment, Park allowed himself to hope that the avalanche might have finally stopped his pursuer. The hope lasted exactly 15 seconds. Garrix burst through the rockfall like it was made of paper, his blade appendages extended and glowing with their own internal heat. The fall had barely scratched his armor. By the end of the 4th day, Park had led Garrix through toxic gas zones. That would have killed most life forms, across fields of razor-sharp crystal formations that shredded his boots, and into areas where the temperature fluctuations were so extreme that metal became brittle. Park's supplies were running dangerously low. His water was nearly gone. Purification tablets couldn't handle the level of contamination in Kethmoran's water sources, and his food supplies had been reduced to emergency rations that tasted like cardboard and provided barely enough calories to keep him moving. Worse than the supply situation were his injuries. Garrix's claws had come close enough to leave marks several times. A near miss on the 4th evening had opened a gash on Park's left arm that went down to the bone. Another close call had left 3 parallel cuts across his back that burned, like fire every time he moved. High in orbit, the alien observers watched with growing fascination. What had started as a betting pool on how quickly the human would die had evolved into something approaching respect. Commander Velthak found himself actually hoping the small creature would survive another day. Look at his movement patterns, the Vraxian delegate pointed out to his colleagues. He's not running randomly. Every retreat leads toward prepared positions. Every trap builds on the previous one. This level of tactical thinking is unexpected. The Nethri representative coiled thoughtfully. His species' military training appears more sophisticated than our initial assessment suggested. Still, physical limitations will eventually doom him. On the 5th night, exhausted beyond anything he had ever experienced, Park took shelter in a cave system he had discovered during his reconnaissance. As he treated his wounded arm with improvised medical supplies made from his first aid kit and materials scavenged from the environment, he made a discovery that changed everything. Scattered around the cave floor were the remains of previous trial challenges, not just bones but equipment, weapons that were far more advanced than his basic energy rifle, armor that would have protected against environmental hazards that were slowly killing him, survival gear that could have made this trial manageable, instead of nearly impossible. Park picked up a Kethani battlesuit that could have shielded him from acid rain and temperature extremes. Next to it lay a Draknari plasma weapon that could have actually damaged Garrix's armor. Medical supplies that could have healed his injuries in minutes instead of days. All of this equipment had belonged to warriors from species that were physically superior to humans in every measurable way. Beings with natural armor, enhanced strength, extended lifespans, and advanced technology. Yet they had all died on Kethmoran, leaving their superior equipment scattered like tombstones. As Park bandaged his arm with strips torn from his shirt, a realization hit him that was both terrifying and liberating. The trial wasn't about strength or technology, or even survival skills. Every species that had attempted this challenge had focused on overpowering Kethmoran's dangers or outlasting them through superior equipment. They had all missed the point. Entirely. The difference between him and every warrior who had died in this cave wasn't physical capability or technological advantage. It was something that couldn't be measured or manufactured or enhanced through genetic engineering. It was the refusal to give up. It was the human characteristic that aliens found most baffling and primitive, the absolute stubborn refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat was mathematically certain. Park finished bandaging his arm and checked his remaining supplies. Less than 2 days of water. Maybe 1 day of food if he was careful. His weapon was nearly depleted and his injuries were slowing him down. But as he prepared to face another day of being hunted by the most dangerous predator in known space, Park felt something he hadn't experienced since landing on Kethmoran. He smiled. Outside the cave, Garrix's grinding laughter echoed across the wasteland. The war criminal was getting closer, confident that tomorrow would bring the end of this entertaining but ultimately futile chase. He had no idea that he was about to face something no alien species truly understood, a human being who had decided to stop running. The sixth morning brought with it a decision that would either save Park's life or end it in the most spectacular way possible. As he crawled out of his cave shelter, every muscle in his body screaming in protest, Park looked at the tracking device on his wrist and made a choice that defied every survival instinct he possessed. He stopped running. For 2 days, he had been the prey in a hunt that was slowly killing him through exhaustion and accumulated injuries. His water was gone, his food reduced to a few protein bars that tasted like chalk, and his body was held together by improvised bandages and sheer willpower. Garax, meanwhile, seemed to be enjoying the chase more with each passing hour, his taunting laughter echoing across the wasteland whenever he got close enough for Park to hear. But Park had learned something during those desperate days of running and hiding. Garax was a predator, and predators followed patterns. They had preferred hunting grounds, favorite tactics, and most importantly, they had egos that could be exploited. Park spent the morning studying the terrain maps he had memorized during his mission briefing. 3 kilometers to the east lay a narrow canyon called the Devil's Throat, carved by millions of years of acid storms and seismic activity. The canyon was barely wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, with walls that rose nearly 100 meters straight up. It was a death trap for anyone caught inside during one of Kethmoran's violent electrical storms, which made it perfect for what Park had in mind. The storm season was reaching its peak, and the atmospheric readings on his scanner showed a massive electrical disturbance building in the west. It would hit the canyon in approximately 6 hours, bringing with it lightning that could vaporize anything caught in the open and electromagnetic pulses that would disrupt most electronic equipment. Park gathered everything he had salvaged from the fallen warriors in the cave. A Kethani plasma grenade with just enough charge left for 1 detonation. Fragments of Draknari armor plating that could be rigged into makeshift explosives. Medical stimulants from a Vraxian first aid kit that would keep him conscious even with fatal injuries. Most importantly, he had learned something about Garax during their deadly game of tag. The war criminal was arrogant to a fault, convinced that his superior size and strength made him invincible. He fought like a creature that had never faced a real challenge, relying on brute force rather than tactics. Park spent the afternoon preparing his battlefield. He carved false handholds into the canyon walls that would collapse under Garax's weight. He rigged the plasma grenade to detonate when the canyon's natural acoustics amplified sound to a specific frequency. He even used his own blood, dripped carefully along the canyon floor, to create a trail that would lead Garax exactly where Park wanted him. As the first rumbles of thunder echoed across the wasteland, Park took his position at the far end of the canyon and activated his emergency beacon. The signal would draw Garax like a magnet, and the confined space would negate most of his size advantage. Garax arrived just as the storm reached its full fury. Lightning crackled overhead in sheets of purple and gold, and the thunder was so loud it felt like physical blows. The war criminal had to hunch over to fit through the narrow canyon entrance, his blade appendages scraping sparks off the walls. "Little soft skin thinks to make a stand." Garax's voice boomed even over the thunder. His crystalline armor reflected the lightning, making him look like a living weapon forged from the storm itself. "I have killed warriors from 12 species, creatures with natural armor that could deflect starship weapons, beings with strength that could crush vehicles. You are nothing but meat and fragile bones." Park stood at the far end of the canyon, looking impossibly small against the massive predator advancing toward him. His energy weapon was in his hands, but both of them knew it was useless against Garax's armor. This wasn't going to be won with superior firepower. "You're right," Park called back, his voice somehow carrying clearly through the storm. "I'm weaker than every warrior you've killed, slower than most of them. My weapons are primitive compared to theirs." Garax paused, confused by this admission. Prey didn't usually acknowledge their inferiority so calmly. "But there's one thing you don't understand about humans," Park continued, and now there was something in his voice that made even the confident war criminal hesitate. "We're too stupid to know when we're beaten. What happened next would be analyzed by military strategists for centuries, Park didn't try to match Garrix's strength or speed. Instead, he used every dirty trick, every unconventional tactic, every bit of battlefield cunning he had learned in 3 decades of warfare. When Garrix charged, Park triggered the false handholds he had carved in the canyon walls. The war criminal's own momentum worked against him, as chunks of rock came crashing down. Not enough to seriously injure him, but enough to throw off his timing. When Garrix tried to corner him in the narrow space, Park used the Vraxian stimulants to push his reflexes beyond human limits, dodging attacks that should have been impossible to avoid. When Garrix finally got close enough to strike a killing blow, Park screamed at exactly the right frequency and volume to trigger the rigged plasma grenade. The explosion lit up the canyon like a miniature sun. Garrix's armor, designed to withstand energy weapons and physical attacks, couldn't handle the combination of explosive force, lightning strikes from the storm above, and the acoustic resonance of the canyon walls. When the light faded and the thunder quieted, Park stood over Garrix's motionless form. His own body was broken in ways that should have been fatal. 3 ribs cracked, internal bleeding, burns across half his torso, and a concussion that made the world spin like a carnival ride. But he was standing, and Garrix wasn't. High in orbit. The Council observers sat in complete silence. Commander Velthak stared at his monitors in disbelief. The small primitive creature they had dismissed as weakest of the weak had just defeated a war criminal that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries. "How?" the Nethri representative whispered. "He refused to lose," Commander Velthak replied, quietly. "Even when losing was the only logical outcome." Park looked up at the storm-filled sky, knowing the alien observers were watching. He raised one shaking hand in what might have been a salute, or simply an acknowledgement that he was still alive. One more day. He just had to survive one more day, and humanity would have its place among the stars. The storm began to clear, and Park started the long walk toward his extraction point, leaving behind the body of something that had once been considered invincible. The 7th day began with Park barely able to open his eyes. The combination of injuries from his battle with Garrix and the cumulative effects of Keth Moran's toxic environment had pushed his body beyond what should have been survivable. His internal organs were slowly shutting down from poison absorption. His broken ribs made each breath feel like someone was stabbing him with hot knives, and the burns across his torso had become infected with alien bacteria that his immune system couldn't fight. Park's extraction beacon showed 12 hours until pickup. 12 hours that might as well have been 12 years given his current condition. Every step sent waves of agony through his damaged body, and black spots danced at the edges of his vision. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold his water container, which contained only a few sips of purified liquid anyway. The smart thing would have been to find a safe place to hide and wait for rescue. Park knew he was running on borrowed time, and any unnecessary movement was hastening his body's collapse. But intelligence and human nature didn't always align, especially when someone had been poisoned by an alien death world for a week. Around midday, as Park struggled across a field of broken crystalline formations, he heard something that made him stop despite every survival instinct screaming at him to keep moving. Voices. Multiple voices speaking in the universal trade language, but distorted by pain and desperation. Following the sounds, Park discovered the entrance to what had once been a cave system before a recent seismic event had caused it to partially collapse. Trapped beneath tons of rubble were 3 figures, visible only because of gaps between the fallen rocks. Even in his deteriorating mental state, Park recognized what he was looking at. These were fresh exiles, probably dropped off within the last few days. Their clothing was still intact, their equipment hadn't been scavenged yet, and they were still healthy enough to call for help. Which meant they were almost certainly dangerous criminals who had been sentenced to death on Keth Moran for crimes that civilized species couldn't stomach executing quickly. The first figure was clearly Draknari, one of the warrior species known for their honor-based culture and incredible physical strength. His scaled hide was torn and bleeding, and one of his arms was trapped beneath a boulder that would have taken a construction crew to move. The second was Kethani, an insectoid being whose natural exoskeleton had been cracked like an eggshell by the falling rocks. Green fluid leaked from the cracks, and his compound eyes had lost their normal shimmer, indicating severe internal damage. The third was something Park didn't immediately recognize, a gaseous being contained within a damaged environmental suit. The suit's life support systems were failing, and without immediate repair, the creature inside would dissipate into the toxic atmosphere. By all logic, Park should have kept walking. These beings were here because they had committed acts so heinous that even their own species couldn't tolerate their existence. They were murderers, war criminals, or worse. Helping them would drain his remaining strength and medical supplies, virtually guaranteeing that he wouldn't survive to reach the extraction point. Instead, Park found himself climbing over the rubble pile toward the trapped criminals. Human? The Draknari's voice was weak but filled with disbelief. You are the trial challenger? Why do you approach? We are condemned beings. Park didn't answer immediately. He was too busy studying the cave-in, looking for weak points where carefully applied pressure might shift the debris without causing a complete collapse. His engineering training from military demolitions work kicked in automatically, even though his brain was operating at maybe 60% capacity. The Kethani made clicking sounds that might have been laughter or crying. The soft skin wishes. To die with us? How poetic. We who have taken countless lives will perish alongside one who saves them. Park began working methodically to free the trapped beings. He used pieces of salvaged equipment as levers, creating fulcrums from smaller rocks to move debris that weighed several times what he could normally lift. It was backbreaking work that reopened wounds and sent fresh waves of poison through his system. But Park kept going with the mechanical persistence that had kept him alive all week. The gaseous being's environmental suit was the easiest fix. Park used components from his own emergency kit to patch the life support system, sharing his last functional air filters to keep the creature stable. It meant he would have no backup if his own suit failed, but the being would live. Freeing the Kethani required more creativity. Park rigged an improvised pulley system using climbing gear and created enough space for the insectoid to crawl out of the rubble. The creature's injuries were severe, and Park used his remaining medical supplies to stabilize the worst of the damage. The Draknari was the most challenging rescue. The boulder pinning his arm was simply too massive to move with improvised tools. Park had to carefully excavate around it, creating a narrow tunnel that allowed the warrior to pull himself free. The process took hours and left Park's hands bleeding from scraping against sharp rocks. High in orbit, the alien observers watched this behavior with complete bewilderment. Commander Velthak turned to his colleagues, his crystalline features, showing the first genuine confusion any of them had displayed all week. "Explain this to me," he said. "The human is dying. He has perhaps hours of life remaining. Yet he expends his final strength-saving condemned criminals who would likely kill him if they were healthy enough." The Nethri representative coiled thoughtfully. "Among our species, such behavior would be considered madness. Resources are finite. Self-preservation is the highest priority." "But look at the result," the Kethani delegate clicked. "He has gained allies, beings who are now in his debt." As if to prove the point, when Park finally collapsed from exhaustion just 2 kilometers from the extraction zone, the 3 criminals he had saved didn't abandon him. The Draknari, despite his damaged arm, lifted Park onto his back. The Kethani used his remaining strength to clear obstacles from their path. The gaseous being in the environmental suit scouted ahead for dangers. Together they carried humanity's champion to the pickup point, just as the rescue transport descended through Kethmoran's poisonous atmosphere. The alien observers sat in stunned silence, beginning to understand that they had fundamentally misunderstood what made humans dangerous. It wasn't their technology or their physical capabilities or even their tactical thinking. It was their complete refusal to abandon others, even when doing so defied logic, survival instinct, and basic self-preservation. They had witnessed something that no other species in the galaxy truly possessed: the willingness to sacrifice everything for beings who didn't deserve salvation. As the transport lifted off with Park barely alive in its medical bay, the Council observers knew they had seen something that would change how the galaxy viewed humanity forever. The weak species had just proven they understood something about strength that the rest of the galaxy had forgotten. The first sensation Park became aware of was the absence of pain. For 7 days, agony had been his constant companion. Burns, broken bones, poison coursing through his veins, and the general misery of a body pushed far beyond its limits. Now, lying in what felt like the most comfortable bed in the universe, he experienced His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to soft lighting that was nothing like Kethmoran's harsh alien glow. The ceiling above him was smooth and white, with patterns of light that pulsed gently like a heartbeat. Advanced medical equipment surrounded his bed, devices that looked more like art than machinery, humming quietly as they monitored his recovery. Park tried to sit up and was surprised to find he could move without agony shooting through his body. His ribs, which had been cracked and painful for days, felt perfectly normal. The burns that had covered half his torso were gone, leaving only faint lines on his skin like old scars. Even his hands, which had been torn and bloodied from the rescue work, showed no signs of injury. "Easy there, soldier." The familiar voice made Park turn his head. Ambassador Kim sat in a chair beside the bed, and Park was shocked to see tears streaming down the diplomat's face. Kim looked like he hadn't slept in days, his usually perfect appearance rumpled and exhausted. "Sir?" Park's voice came out as a croak. His throat felt raw, though the medical equipment had obviously repaired most of the damage from breathing Kethmoran's toxic atmosphere. Kim wiped his eyes and leaned forward. "How do you feel?" Park took inventory of his body. Everything seemed to be working properly, which was miraculous considering he remembered collapsing near the extraction point with multiple organ systems shutting down. "Like I got hit by a truck, then put back together by magic. Where are we?" "Council Medical Facility, Nexus Prime." Kim's voice was quiet, reverent almost. "You've been unconscious for 3 days while their healing matrices worked on you. The doctors said you were about 6 hours from complete system failure when the transport picked you up." The memories came flooding back. The week of hell on Kethmoran, the battle with Garax, the rescue of the condemned criminals. Park closed his eyes, trying to process that he had actually survived something that was designed to be impossible. "The trial," Park said. "Did I pass?" Kim's face broke into a smile that was equal parts joy and disbelief. "The council voted 2 hours after you were brought in. Unanimous admission to the galactic community, not just membership, Park. They're offering Earth a permanent seat on the Security Council." Park stared at the ceiling, trying to wrap his mind around what that meant. A week ago, humanity had been dismissed as the weakest species ever to petition the Council. Now they were being offered a position of power that only the most respected civilizations held. "There's more," Kim continued. "High Counselor Zethmar himself has requested a personal audience with you. The footage of your trial has been transmitted to every military academy in known space. They're calling it required viewing for anyone who wants to understand combat psychology." Through the medical bay's large viewport, Park could see movement. In the corridor outside, alien beings of various species waited patiently, all of them clearly important based on their elaborate clothing and the way the station personnel treated them with obvious respect. "They all want to meet you," Kim explained, following Park's gaze. "Diplomats, military commanders, even representatives from species that voted against our membership. Commander Velthak, the Vraxian who called humans pathetic creatures, has been here every day asking about your condition." Park watched the alien dignitaries through the viewport and felt a strange sense of disconnection. These beings had spent centuries building an image of power through strength, technology, and conquest. Yet here they were, waiting to meet a human soldier who had survived through nothing more than stubborn refusal to quit. "The criminals you saved," Kim added quietly. "They've all requested to speak with you as well. The Draknari warrior Kethvar has declared a life debt to you. In his culture, that's the highest honor possible. The others have done similar things according to their own traditions." Park closed his eyes again. The whole situation felt surreal, like waking up from a fever dream to find that the nightmare had somehow turned into a fairy tale. A week ago, he had been a normal soldier preparing for what everyone believed would be a suicide mission. Now he was apparently the most famous human in the galaxy. "Sir," Park said, opening his eyes to meet Kim's gaze, "when can I see my family?" The question hung in the air like a prayer. Not when would he address the council, or when would he meet with military leaders, or when would he give interviews about his experience. Just when could he go home to the people who mattered most to him? Kim smiled, and this time the tears in his eyes looked like relief rather than stress. "Transport. To Earth leaves in 6 hours if you're medically cleared. Your daughter has been asking about you every day. Your wife says she's going to ground you for the rest of your life for scaring her like this." Park laughed, and the sound surprised him. After a week of pain, fear, and constant survival pressure, the simple act of laughing felt like a miracle in itself. "That sounds perfect," he said. Outside the viewport, the alien dignitaries continued to wait patiently for their chance to meet the human who had redefined their understanding of strength. But Park's attention was already turning homeward, to a small house where a 10-year-old girl was probably practicing the speech she would give him about taking unnecessary risks. In the years that followed, whenever alien species spoke of humanity, they would use new words. Not weak or primitive or fragile, but determined, loyal and unbreakable. The story of Staff Sergeant Park Min-ho would become legend, taught to young beings across the galaxy as an example of what true strength really meant. But in that moment, lying in an alien medical base surrounded by technology beyond human understanding, Park